Okay, so yes, wonderful. So thank you so much for joining us today, everyone. This is part of our series of events for the Pride Month, LGBTQ plus Pride Month, and this session is Beyond the Binary, Acknowledging Gender Identity and Expressions Within the Workplace. We wanted to put together this session just because within the network, we are trying to really highlight some of the LGBT communities that maybe don't get seen or spoken about as much. And so that was the goal behind this particular presentation. You can see there's going to be sort of 3 stages to it today. So I'll be starting you off in a moment. And then we also have Jess Aniston, who is going to join us and deliver a few slides from the, I believe it's linguistics department. And then Giuseppe is going to finish us off at the end with a sort of EDI focus. So, my name's Cor. I use they, them pronouns, and I work in the Outreach and Student Success department as an assistant, and I'll be talking to you about non-binary and me and sort of giving you my own personal experiences on coming out in the workplace. So, gender identity, is it new and unfamiliar? The truth is, it isn't. So trans people have existed for a long time, in fact, since people have existed, but the words we've used to describe groups of people, or the words used by those groups to describe themselves, can only develop when enough people are connected and visible. The concept of gender experience describes the relationship between a person's gender and the gender they were presumed at birth. So most people have what is referred to as a cis experience of their gender. So that means that if you were born and they said it's a girl and you grow up and you identify as a girl. But some people do have a trans experience of their gender. So that means that when they were born, people said, "Ooh, we think this is a girl based on your chromosomes, based on your parts." And then when you grow up, you don't associate with that and you transition, in many cases, into being a different gender. And in some cultures around the world, there are 3 or 4 or more distinct genders just between the two that we maybe know of in Western culture. In many cases, and in fact in all cases, trans should be used as an adjective. So in the same way that you would say someone is a tall woman, you would say they're a transgender woman. It's really important that we acknowledge that, and I think Jess has some slides on this later on. So what does non-binary mean? So a non-binary person is someone who is not exclusively male or female. This includes people who have no binary gender at all, so they might sit entirely outside of that male and female box, and people who have some relationship to binary gender, such as gender fluid people. Some people might identify across the binary and non-binary genders. It's important to remember that concepts of gender are entirely different across cultural groups, and some people might depict genders on a scale, on a spectrum, and while this is really helpful for sort of helping us visualize gender, for some, gender can be a lot more complex than any chart can show, and that's kind of what makes it so wonderful. And that's why we have these umbrella terms, and you can see my little infographic here. So the umbrella term most of you will probably be familiar with is trans or trans and gender diverse, and there's a lot of talk about the trans community, but under that big umbrella there's all these other littler ones. And that doesn't mean those communities are any smaller, it just means those communities have come up with terms that more accurately describe their experience. So that might be genderqueer, that might be people who identify as agender, and specifically for myself and my experiences that I'm going to be talking to you about, we're looking at non-binary. So what to do if someone tells you you're non-binary? So first off, you can ask them what pronouns they'd like to use. They might choose to tell you this themselves without any prompting, but it's really useful to show that you're immediately accepting of them telling you that they are identifying as something that is different to identifying as just male or female. Some people might choose one set of pronouns. Some people might say, I'm happy with any of them. Some say, I'm happy with 2 or 3 different ones, but I really don't like this. It's entirely different for everyone. So it's really important that you don't just assume that a non-binary person will automatically use they, them, for example. You can ask who you're okay to discuss it with, if anyone. So this is really important because you should never out someone without their consent. So outing is telling someone this person is trans or this person's non-binary when that person hasn't said they're comfortable for that information to be shared. And it's the same as if you were to go around telling people someone was gay without them saying that they were okay with that. It can put them in a dangerous situation if the person you're disclosing that to isn't accepting. So it's really important that you have that discussion on who can you talk to about it and is that person comfortable with you saying. They might say, I don't mind if you want to tell people that I've changed my name, or you can just say, actually, they are cool now and they go by they, them. And that's all I'm comfortable with you telling other people. If they have more questions, they can come to me and I'd rather handle that conversation myself, as an example. And if someone starts using a new name or term of address, so perhaps changing from Miss to Mix, then you should start using that right away, unless, again, the non-binary person specifies otherwise. So if the person says, I am comfortable with you knowing, but I'm not maybe ready for my team to know or for my students to know if they're an academic, then it's important that you respect those boundaries that they might have, because coming out is a scary process for a lot of people. And that's one of the reasons why we're holding this today, to just give you all some tips on how you can support your colleagues in doing it. So what are some of the options for pronouns? This is a question that I got asked a lot when I came out, and there are hundreds. These are just some of the ones that I found, perhaps some of the more well-known ones. So most people know of he, him, his, she, her, hers. We have the sort of independent they, them, theirs, which is very common for non-binary people to sort of use if they do like that sort of singular they. But we do have a whole set of neopronouns like sie, them, sie, and many more that people might use. So again, if someone says, I use this pronoun, and you don't know what the background for that pronoun is or how you're meant to pronounce it, that's okay. But just ask, or you can go away and look it up, and there will definitely be information online, and I think we have some resources that might help at the end. How can you be a good ally? So there are lots of little everyday things that you can do to support your trans, non-binary staff and students, and I've included the 5 that I think are most important on this slide. So first off, don't question someone for using the bathroom or changing room that they feel comfortable with. The worst experience in the world is when you just really want to go to the loo and someone starts challenging you on why you're in that space. At Lancaster, we do have a bunch of gender neutral toilets on campus, and we have got a map that actually identifies where these are, but not every trans person or every non-binary person will want to use a gender neutral bathroom. A lot of them will want to use the bathroom that they feel most closely associates with their. Sorry, I seem to be muted for a second there. Can you all hear me?
Yes, Cor, we can hear you.
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry, I just got a message that my thing had stopped working. So that's really important, that if someone says, look, I feel for my gender identity, I'm more comfortable in the women's restroom, that's entirely up to them. Likewise, if they feel more comfortable in the men's or using a gender neutral bathroom, it's not for you to question it. And if you want to be a good ally to someone, just be supportive of a colleague who you know might have difficult interactions in those environments, and make sure you're there if they need that support. Standing up against banter and any sort of transphobic language or behaviour by calling it out and reporting it. And again, this is really important because the colleague or student themselves might not feel like they can report it, or they might have concerns that it won't be taken seriously. So it's really helpful when we see allies saying, you really can't use language like that, or I'm really not comfortable with how so-and-so referred to you in that meeting, I'm going to pass it on to our line manager. And that just shows us that we have that support there, and that people are recognizing that those behaviors and those languages, that it's not okay. If you make a mistake, either with a name change or a title change or a pronoun change, just apologise, make an effort to get it right in the future, and move on. No one wants to sit there listening to you tell us how awful you feel because you made a mistake. We know it's not going to happen right away. Just say out you're sorry and move on. If it happens frequently, that's when we start to worry that maybe it's a lack of understanding or a lack of respect and dignity. But an occasional mistake, everyone messes up, and that's okay. You can put your pronouns in your bio or email signature and invite people to share them when introducing themselves at meetings. So again, this is a really easy way that you can signify that you are a safe space for trans and non-binary staff and students to come to if they need a supportive person. You can also join the Safe Home-Based Ally Scheme, which there's a load of information on our web pages about, and I'm sure Giuseppe can give you some more at the end if you're interested. And then it's always important to use the language that the trans and non-binary people use for themselves. So it can be helpful to ask yourself why you're talking about someone's gender identity to others, and if you would do the same thing for a cisgender friend. So for example, you would just say, hi, this is my friend Kelly. You wouldn't necessarily say, hi, this is my cis friend Kelly. So don't say, hi, this is my trans friend Kelly. If you just say, this is Kelly, then that's all the information you need to give out. And likewise, if you're talking about a student, if it's not relevant, you don't need to bring it up. So coming out as non-binary in the workplace can be scary and full of unknowns, just like coming out as trans can be. And as someone who has gone through and is currently going through sort of that process recently, the advice I would give to anyone supporting a colleague who is coming out is to be patient and kind. Coming out doesn't happen overnight. And in fact, once you start, you never really stop. You are continually having to re-out yourself to new people who join the team or people who you maybe don't work with as often, who won't know. And what might feel right at first or can also change. So an initial change in pronouns might then change as you find ones that are more suited, or a change in a title or a name can take time to discover what feels right for you, and that's absolutely okay. And it's important that as an ally you make sure your staff and students know that that doesn't make their identity any less valid. I also absolutely recognise that it can be hard to ask questions, and if you do want to be a good ally, you often want to know, well, who can I ask this to if I don't want to bother this particular staff or student with asking them loads of questions that they might not know the answers to right now. So I'm more than happy to answer any questions and share my own experiences and journey with anyone who might find that helpful. There will be time at the end if you want to ask questions then, or if you don't necessarily feel like saying publicly I have these questions, I'm also happy for people to contact me individually at core.garner@lancaster.ac.uk. So I believe that is me finished. Jess, are you around?
Yes, hello.
Perfect. I think you've managed to take back control, so I'll just mute.
Okay, so thank you for that, Cor. My name's Jessica Aston. I'm a linguistics PhD student in the Department of Linguistics and English Language, and also an associate lecturer. So I research anti-feminist sexist language on the internet. And I'm going to talk to you today about gender inclusive language. So last year, during the summer, I was working with Dr. Claire Nance. We were putting together an application for an Athena Swan Bronze Award. So Athena Swan is an award which aims to recognise good practice relating to gender equality in higher education. So things like, do we have enough female professors? Are male students more likely to receive first-class degrees? As of last week, we found out that we did receive this award, which is great news. And as part of our application, I've produced a set of gender-inclusive language guidelines, which aimed to help people avoid language or phrasings which may be discriminatory towards women, LGBT people, trans people. So in this presentation, I'm going to show some examples of gender-inclusive language, specifically in relation to trans or non-binary people, because this is an area where a lot of people don't have a lot of information or knowledge. So first of all, so when referring to someone whose gender is unknown or irrelevant, such as a hypothetical research participant or a student, consider using the third person pronouns they rather than he or she, or in brackets s, he. So for example, a student is entitled to 5 hours contact time with their supervisor, as opposed to his or her supervisor. Singular they is still grammatically correct, even when referring to a single person. It's been in use since the 14th century, so it's definitely not a new thing. And when referring to a large group of people, you could consider using gender neutral language rather than gendered language. So saying things like hello everyone or hello all, or I've even heard distinguished guests as opposed to saying things like ladies and gentlemen. This is important. It demonstrates that you're being inclusive and acknowledging that you may not know the gender of everybody that's in your group. Similarly, you can use terms like spouses or partners instead of saying things like husbands and wives or boyfriends and girlfriends. And this is especially important because as well as being inclusive of all genders, you're also being inclusive of all sexualities and people of different marital statuses, so people who aren't married, for example. And similarly to gender neutral language, you could also use gender neutral job titles. So instead of saying like chairman, you could say chairperson or simply chair. And this is also important that it's more inclusive of women as well. You could also use gender neutral honorifics or titles such as doctor or professor, if applicable, of course. And if you'd like a gender neutral equivalent to Miss or Mr, some people also use mix as well, like Cor said earlier. So some information on how to refer to transgender people. Firstly, it's really important to note that trans and transgender are both adjectives rather than nouns. So instead of saying transgenders plural or a trans, you instead say transgender person or trans people. Similarly, don't say that somebody is transgendered like it's a verb, something that's happened to them, because this doesn't line up with how most trans people view themselves. Similarly, it's trans woman, trans men with a space in between, showing that it's an adjective modifying them rather than a compound noun, trans woman, trans men, because this sort of language implies that it's a separate category of women rather than a modern. And when referring to someone's birth assignment, terms like assigned female at birth or designated male at birth tend to be preferred to phrases like born female or used to be a man, because the latter phrases simplify a very complex experience and don't match up with how a lot of people view their identity. Whereas using things like assigned sex at birth, that acknowledges that the issue stems from society misgendering people when they are born, rather than people changing their identity. It's also important to, somebody has taken control of the presentation. It's also important to use language that validates people's identities. So this is reflecting back what Cor said in that referring to trans people the same way you would refer to cis people. So just like you would say Sarah is a woman, you should also say that Alex is non-binary or Alex is agender or whatever gender Alex is. Saying things like Alex identifies as agender is often the right way, is often good. But if you say Alex identifies as agender in the same sentence as you would say Sarah is a woman, that could suggest that Alex's identity is perhaps less legitimate than Sarah's. And often people will say things like someone's preferred pronouns, which signifies that it's a preference rather than something that's, required. So you could simply refer to somebody's pronouns or somebody's name. So of course, sometimes you may have a set of pronouns that you use and you have a preferred one out of those. But what I mean by this is a cis person, don't say that a trans person has preferred pronouns while a cis person just has pronouns. But again, as a disclaimer, it's always important to remember that different people have different preferences. So some people may use terms that other people don't like using, and if you're never sure what to use, always deflect back to what the actual trans or non-binary person is saying. And finally, some advice on gender inclusive academic practices. So if you are writing publications or doing surveys, first of all, you should try and avoid a binary male-female option when creating survey materials. So if you're writing a survey and you're asking people for your gender, don't just say, are you male or are you female? You could have a text option to allow people to write in their own responses. You could have a long list, so including non-binary as an option. It's also important, you could also consider allowing participants to opt out of answering the question altogether, or saying something like prefer not to say. It's also important to think about whether this information is necessary for your research. Very often we ask participants for their gender like by default without actually thinking about whether we need this in order to interpret or analyse our findings. Another important thing is avoid having trans women or trans men as separate options from women and men. So, you go a survey and it says, what's your gender? Then it says male, female, trans male. This kind of option suggests that trans men and trans women aren't really men or aren't really women. So instead, this could be a separate question. So if you need to know if you have trans people doing your survey, you could ask a question such as, do you identify as transgender? Or you could also have cis male different to cis female, or cis male, trans female. The important thing is don't have male and then trans male. And also when you're writing up publications, if you are citing someone who is trans or non-binary, take care to use the correct pronouns when citing them. It should go without saying, but also avoid using their dead name when citing their older work. So there is an issue sometimes. Someone could publish under one name and then change their name, and so you may not know how to cite them. In this case, it's better to use their current name rather than their dead name, and you don't need to use their old name. So don't say, and this was written by Jenny, who used to be called John. You can just say Jenny. So finally, why is all of this important? There are many ways in which our language choices can be very subtly or sometimes overtly transphobic or discriminatory, even if we don't necessarily realise it or intend it to be that way. So therefore, it's really important to pay attention to the language that we use and ensure that we're not excluding people. It may not feel like a big ideal to you. You may think that it's just words, but it's very important for your audience. And even doing little things like saying everybody instead of ladies and gentlemen could go a long way to help make someone feel included. And the golden rule, if you're ever unsure of how to describe or refer to someone, the best thing you can do is simply ask. And that is everything. I will hand you over to Giuseppe. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Jess, and thank you, Cor. So, hello, everyone. My name is Giuseppe. I'm the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Advisor at Lancaster University. And in this last slot of the session today, I'm going to talk about the way we developed our trans policy and guidance. I see that I lost control of the slides, so just a second. And I want to talk about the process that went through that we undertook to develop this policy on gender identity and expression, and also the journey we started, but also the fact that the policy and guidance is an outcome, but also a first step towards a longer and continual path of inclusion and trans inclusion in Lancaster. However, before going into the nitty-gritty of developing a trans policy and guidance, I thought it could be interesting to reflect a little bit more, especially this month on Pride Month, about the historical and sociological context and framework in which we develop policies and official documents. So a policy is not just a document in itself, it's not created in a vacuum. And when we think about the trans community. And when I say trans here, I mean it as an umbrella term, as Cor explained before. We can see that the trans people and the trans community were really always there. They have always existed, and they've been really fundamental to kickstart the contemporary LGBTQ+ movement as we know it today. So, for example, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera were activists who were trans, and that contributed greatly to the birth of the current LGBTQ+ movement. And Marsha P. Johnson in particular was part of the Stonewall riots that really gave birth to many of the advocacy and inclusion activities and initiatives that we are doing already also today. At the same time, I don't know, you may already be familiar with it, but I found out recently that prior to Stonewall, transgender women, among whom there was also Dana Persona, who I pasted the picture on the slide on the top right, already protested against police brutality a few years before Stonewall at the Compton's cafeteria in San Francisco. So we can even say that the trans community and trans women kickstarted the movement even before the whole LGBTQ+ community. And if we look closely at the UK, already in the 19th century, people like Edward Carpenter were theorizing the need of more gender equality and of sexual reform in UK culture and legislation. And Carpenter also used the term intermediate sex to describe men and women who don't really fall within the binaries of male and female. So it may seem an outdated term today, but it's really significant that already in the 19th century, there were people that were aware of the fact that gender is not necessarily a binary thing. And looking closely to Lancaster University, we also have a history of LGBTQ+ activism. Since the very foundation of our university, students organized in groups and societies that represented gay and lesbian students. I'm not sure if there was explicit representation of trans lives and experiences, but definitely this happened, and the representation of different groups within the LGBTQ+ movement continued in the years after the university foundation. And I'm saying all this really to highlight that there is a need for a policy on gender identity and expression, or at least of tools to support trans students and staff, because trans people have always been there, but also because trans students and staff face unique challenges in the workplace or during the program of studies. And in particular, the very fact of being trans or non-binary sometimes represents already a challenge to a system and to processes and a way we organize our services that is based consciously or unconsciously on heteronormative and gender binary assumptions. So having a discussion around creating a policy or ways we can support trans community at Lancaster was also helpful to already challenge and reflect a little bit more on our own experiences and on the way we take things for granted sometimes. It's not only just a question of culture, though. We have some legal obligations as higher education institutions, and the Equality Act, for instance, provide protections for trans people under the protected characteristics of gender reassignment. The definition of gender reassignment is narrower than the definitions that Cor was talking before, for instance, but it's still quite important because he recognized transition as a social or personal experience and not just as a medical one, and it constitutes a legal basis that can allow us thinking of ways to protect and to support and remove barriers for trans inclusion here at Lancaster. and in universities more general. Jess already talked about Athena Swan and how the goal of monitoring and advancing gender equality at universities also include trans equality. And I would add also the work and our membership with Stonewall, which looks at the way we monitor and advance LGBT+ inclusion in our university. And both mechanisms highlighted the gap there was at Lancaster in terms of structures that can provide support for our trans community. Ultimately, the university affirms with policy and in general with their strategy that we need to have a safe space where everyone can express themselves and be free to do so without hurting others. This brings to another point why having a policy and guidance is important. There are some elements that reflect some changes that reflect societal changes. There is a change in demographics ongoing, and there are more and more people who come out as trans and non-binary, or with the other terminology that Cor was talking about before. And data sometimes don't really capture this complexity. Oftentimes, I would say, don't really capture this complexity. So there is a certain agreement that data underestimate actually the extent of and the richness of our trans community. At the same time, surveys like the BSA survey in 2019 highlighted that there is a general sympathy, I quote, for transgender people, but this sympathy doesn't really translate into full acceptance and equality among cisgender men and women when they think about trans people. And so that's also why it's important to provide mechanisms for support. I think the key point in this learning process for us as individuals and as an institution at Lancaster in this process to develop the policy and guidance, and even before in the conversations that were before officially starting this, were the consultation and community engagement in the way students and staff, members of staff, provided feedback and insight on the concerns when it comes to coming out as trans in the workplace or as students, and their anxieties around how to be supported in this very delicate, even if very empowering, but also very delicate and sensitive moment in someone's life. There were many concerns, but some came up quite frequently in the consultations we had. For example, there is anxiety around changing personal records, and something was mentioned also by Cor, I think, before, and the fact that this process could lead to potential breach of confidentiality. So we needed to make sure, and we are still working on that, to be honest. I'm going to talk about it in a minute, but we needed to make sure that these processes were in place and that we could reassure our students and staff regarding this. And there were also anxiety around how to communicate properly, sorry, not properly, safely, actually, someone's gender identity, how to come out. And on the other hand, cisgender staff and students had concerns on how to react to someone's coming out in the workplace or in the learning environment, and after coming out, how to avoid having to constantly explaining themselves as trans people and explain to colleagues what it means to be trans or to be non-binary, and avoiding misgendering. Finally, there were also concerns around using facilities corresponding to someone's gender identity, and make sure that there are effective mechanisms to protect trans people from bullying and harassment. And in this sense, actually, well, I'm not very good in graphic design, but with these arrows, I was trying to make the point that we realized very quickly that these are not isolated issues, but they need to be considered holistically, because if you don't get it right in one area, there can be a cascade effect that have an impact and potentially negative impact also on the other areas that we try to cover with the policy and guidance document. So we followed a certain methodology to develop the policy and guidance. For question of time, I will just focus again on community engagement. So I think we think as an EDI team that this was the most important part of this work. It was a learning experience also for us as officers, so as members of the university community ourselves, but with our own identities and experiences that are of course unique, but also they cannot really fully understand what a trans person can go through. And that's why consulting our community was really important. And also to make sure that we are not barriers ourselves in the way we developed our policy and guidance and in the way we have implemented and we are still implementing it. It was really interesting and useful to have different perspective and gathering information from staff and students. I just want to flag, I think here, and I'm sure there are members of the LGBT plus staff network here today, CORE for instance, but I think that was a very empowering experience for the network as well. They have been really helpful and crucial in every step of the way to really help us to understand the language to use, what kind of expressions were the most appropriate ones, similar to what Jess explained before, and also what were the crucial points that we needed to address with our document. So we finalized a document that includes some tools that are aimed for support, that aim to support our students and staff, and that we identified the need to have of having a transition support plan that could help the line manager or a key contact and the trans person, student or staff, to reflect on all the steps that transitioning at work or during someone's studies, program of studies could entail. And also we thought it important to underline that every experience is unique. So this is a template, of course, but then it needs to be adapted to each one's personal experience. We had the chance to map our database and the databases and the way we record our personal information. And this area, we found out that there are still challenges ahead, in the sense that databases are often not connected and correlated to each other. So at the moment, we were able to provide some information on how to use the different systems, but something more should be done in a way to make the process more coordinated and cohesive. At the same time, it was also interesting to find, for example, that on the student side of things, a change of name form was already in place on our websites, but it seemed, from our understanding, that neither the students nor staff was aware of it. So thanks to this work, the registry team in our university started to think about the form again, updating it, and trying to find ways and thinking of ways to make it more visible. It's also, the development of the policy was also quite important for, in order to link the policy and really trying to embed principles of trans inclusion and more practical provisions in our other policies and projects. So I think CORE mentioned before the existence of a map developed by our student groups in collaboration with facilities that highlight where gender-neutral toilets are on campus. And we aim to build up on this and try to link and to signal where gender-neutral toilets are in our maze map app that we use at Lancaster, for instance, or there is a more direct link between the trans policy now and the policy on bullying and harassment. This process also was also quite important and quite enriching in terms of cultural change. And of course, this leads me to my last point, the point of implementation. So this is really, as I said, the outcome of a long process, but at the same time, it's a first step towards really embedding trans inclusion in our services and processes. I really love this idea of digging into the messiness that I found in some of the papers we read for creating this policy, because it really is messy to create a policy and to apply it and to make sure that it reflects our community, but at the same time try to make it better and more inclusive. And this means that the policy cannot be just a one-shot tool, but it needs to be refreshed continually, and it's especially important, and we plan to create and make sure that there are safe spaces where we can have conversations around these issues, and where not only trans people can feel safe, but also staff can be safe in the sense of making mistakes, because there is often anxiety around this. And again, I think, as Cora and Jess were saying before, it's okay to make mistakes until it doesn't seem to be a pattern, really. And of course, well, there was also the impact of COVID-19, but I think you heard about this ad nauseam over the past year, so I'm just going to say that COVID-19 highlighted how the LGBTQ+ community and people of color are particularly negatively impacted by the way our society is designed, really. And hopefully the policy and its implementation will help us reflect on these factors as well, in terms of visibility and in terms of usefulness of this policy. I don't have anything else to add. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Just the last thing, the policy and guidance are available on our EDI website. They are free to consult to everyone, not just Lancaster staff and students. So feel free to have a look. And if you have a comment now, or even later, just send us an email, me or the EDI team, and we'll be happy to take them on board. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Giuseppe. So I'm just going to go to the last slide, and then I'm going to click stop presenting so people can actually see us. I'm also going to take this time to just stop the recording.